Who is Jesus? What is he doing? And what does it mean to follow him in the world today? My name is Matt Lewis. This is the Follower Podcast, and everyone is invited to the conversation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the Follower Podcast. We got you. Episode 1 wasn't episode 1 and only. I hope it was helpful for you, but we're all the way at episode 2. This is the first episode in a series of 3 called Candles, Cassocks, and Conversions, a journey from religion to relationship and then to responsibility. I'm excited about it, and I think it's going to help all of us as we process through some of these thoughts. A few initial statements before we get going. Number 1, I'd really love for this podcast always to be the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of one. I'm not trying to make the final statement on anything. What I'm trying to do is sow seeds of thought that then get you to go home and have conversations with your friends and family in the places where you live. And then number 2, I am a follower of Jesus. So that's kind of my reference point. And when I share about faith and spirituality, it's only natural that that's kind of where I share from. I think it would be disingenuous for me to try and pretend that that wasn't the case. And I really value authenticity. I really think all real conversation has to happen in a space of authenticity. So when I talk about God, I'm going to be talking about that from my perspective as a Christian. But I do think so many of those ideas are transferable into your world. And I think they can be helpful to everybody at the table. Real tolerance is our ability to sit around the table, massively disagree with one another, and then grab a pizza and be friends at the end of the day. So I'm hoping that's the kind of space we'll be able to get into here. But now, let's talk a little bit about candles and cassocks, or the idea of religion. What would we mean by that? I've got a little bit of a love-hate relationship with religion. I think you get good religion and bad religion. I think religion can be really helpful in some ways, but I think when religion is bad religion, it kind of operates like a Trojan horse that comes in as a gift and then ends up taking over the whole kingdom. And I'm going to talk about both of those elements and hopefully land in a place where religion can maybe be a useful thing that helps us follow Jesus well. So to start a story, which is really my first experience as much as I can remember, where the idea of religion really stood out for me. I grew up in a little town called Benoni. For as long as I can remember, I've always believed in God. So my earliest childhood memory, I think, is me sitting by a river with my dad going, "Dad, how do you know there's a God?" And him saying, "Well, who put the sun in the sky?" And that was just kind of always enough for me. I think that set a foundation of belief. And I've always had a propensity towards spirituality and something more. When we grew up in Benoni, though, we went to a little church down the road, which was an Anglican church. We really went there because my granddad was an Anglican minister. Our family, I don't think I would say that at that point we were sort of spiritually devoted people. I think we just went to church because that's kind of what good people do. And so I ended up going to this church, and over a period of time, I ended up becoming what's called a server. Now, if you know what a server is, Anglican people, you know all about what I'm talking about here. Servers are the guys who wear what's called a cassock. Now, if you don't know what a cassock is, it's like a Batman dress, right? And it's black, and it goes all the way down like a Harry Potter robe, and then you get these kind of white overlays over them. And then they change color, these Batman dresses, these cassocks, depending on different people who are serving in different places, all the way up to the priest who then gets a special one of those and different adornments. Anyway, you get trained to be a server. And when you're a server, one of the things you do is before the service starts, you go to the back of the church and you do what's called the procession. So the whole service starts with the procession. And you get these really long candlesticks with candles on, and then you end up walking down the aisle, following the priest, and everyone's in the serving team doing this together. And so it's all very somber and very serious to some like pretty serious music. And then there's like this whole orchestrated movement where you bow at the right time and kneel at the right time, and you kind of split very strategically like some kind of Christian SWAT team, and then you're down there, and I know I'm making fun. It was all so interesting. And then you lift the candle at the right time, and then there's the bells, ding, 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 doing the things, and it's quite a thing, right? And one of the ladies who trained us to be these servers, she was so serious about serving. Like, this was her thing. And so she was quite intense with what it meant to be a server and how you did this thing. And one of the things she said to us was, when it's time for communion, which is like the thing that Christian people do to remember the last meal that Jesus had with some of his friends, she said, when people come up to receive communion at the rail thing, don't stare at them. Now, that's like putting a sign on the wall and saying, wet paint, don't touch, right? Particularly for a 14, 15-year-old boy. I mean, all I wanted to do was just stare these people down while they were in the midst of this deeply spiritual experience. So you've got me there in my Batman dress, doing the candle dance thing, staring at the wall because I can't stare to the right, and just wondering what on earth is actually happening here. Fast forward a few years, and I'm in the midst of adolescence and everything that comes with that. And so you got drinking and girls and partying. And there would be many mornings, Sunday mornings, where you would wake up early for the early service. You'd be on duty to serve. But the truth is, I'd been partying the night before with my friends. And so that particular Sunday, I was nursing a real hangover. And I can vividly remember there was one Sunday where I was sitting there in the pew, in the sanctuary as a server, wearing my Batman dress, staring at the wall, trying not to look at the people, dealing with a hangover, wondering if I was going to make it through the service, and asking myself, what on earth are we doing? I don't know if you've ever had that experience. And there's the stand-up kneel and all this stuff. Now, as we'll talk about in a little bit, I'm not completely opposed to those things. And actually, some of them are really life-giving later on. Some of it was a little bit of like a pills before swine thing, where I was just 16 years old. And so it doesn't matter how meaningful the candles were, they're still candles, right? But it still bears the point to mention this, is to say sometimes our religious practices are just absurd. They seem so disconnected from the worlds in which we live. I mean, I'd been partying in a club the night before as a 16-year-old boy, and then the Sunday morning I'm dressed in a Batman dress, doing church SWAT team candle maneuvers, and you're just going, what is the connection? And still to this day, when I think back on all that, I think the question I asked myself is, why do we do this? Not only why did we do it then, but why have we always done it? Why for the past 1,000 years or so have we got this evidence, and even more than that, this evidence of human beings finding some kind of religious expression, whether that's sacrificing children in some way, in some kind of, I guess, really barbaric attempt to appease the gods, or whether that's people worshipping animals, or whether that's people worshipping ancestors, or there seems to be something that runs through the course of human history that always pushes us toward the transcendent. And so we build religions around that in order to try and, I guess, take a hold of what's beyond the physicality of our lived experience. Now, I know perhaps if you're listening to this and you're atheistic or anything like that, you would say, well, thank goodness that I've grown out of that. If I could ask a question, though, don't you think perhaps that even secular humanism could be thought of as a religious perspective? It's almost like post-Enlightenment reductionism turned reason into a god, right? So it's almost as if our desire for transcendence didn't leave us in that space, but instead of worshiping a god, we ended up worshiping ourselves. So in fact, God was not dead, God just changed. God changed into us. And now it's interesting as we start to look forward and look at what's happening in our society at the moment. We have this rise of relativistic pluralism, which means like your truth is your truth, and your truth is your truth, and my truth is my truth, which is almost in some senses a backlash to the failure of reductionism. So it's almost we realize that not everything's reducible. Not everything can be put down to cold, hard facts. There are some things that are beyond us. And so now there's this pushback toward relativistic thought, right? And so the God of reason has failed us. But now we're still making gods. So there's a rise in spiritual appetites globally at the moment. And you see this all over the space. I mean, I think about the rise of Scientology, right? Or think about the popularity of like Oprah's Soul Sundays or Deepak Chopra, or think about pilgrimages that are happening to the East and rising interest in Buddhist meditation. There seems to consistently be in our culture this interest in the transcendent. We press toward meaning. Even at the moment, I was watching the most fascinating interview with Russell Brand, and he was talking about, there's this growing thought around artificial intelligence and what they call the singularity, and how there's a possibility with technology that we may actually be in a simulation. So some people really think this. And Russell Brand was saying, isn't it interesting that the same people who are rejecting the notion of God are embracing the idea that we may be in a simulation, or that we may be the products of a higher intelligence, simply because it's couched in non-religious language, it's couched in scientific terms. And I thought that was a fascinating observation, because I think it's probably true that we're always pushing toward transcendence. And I guess my question is, why do we do that? Where does that come from? It's almost as if deep inside of us is this like inbuilt suspicion that there's more going on here, more than what meets the eye. And I would suggest that that suspicion that there is more, the suspicion itself, is an indicator that more actually does exist. C.S. Lewis says this a lot better than me. In a book, Mere Christianity. If you don't know who C.S. Lewis is, I will put the link to his book in the show notes of this podcast, so you can go find them there. I'm going to read to you an extract from his book and then expand on this thought a little bit. He says this. He says, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing the universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be without meaning." So the idea is simply this. If you were born blind, what would the word dark mean to you? Because you would have nothing to compare darkness to. Darkness would just be your lived experience. How would you explain light to a person who was born blind and had no reference of light? Right? In order for that person to understand darkness, in order for them to recognize that darkness was even a thing, that darkness would have to be held up against a counter reality of light. Or when you drink coffee, as an example, and you say, "Oh, this is really bad coffee." How do you know it's bad coffee? You would only know it's bad coffee if you had tasted good coffee. If all you had ever tasted in your life was bad coffee, you wouldn't know that it was bad coffee. It would just be coffee. So now you extend that metaphor, and this is what C.S. Lewis is trying to get to say, when we live in this life, right, and you open the newspaper, and you see news about some atrocious crime, and you go, "That's so wrong." How do you know that's so wrong? Where does your sense of right come from? And when you're in this world and you're dealing with the frustrations of this world, and you're going, surely this can't be all there is. Surely there should be something more. Where does that desire for more come from? Because if this world is all there is, why would you have a desire for something other than it? Right? Great question to ask. C.S. Lewis puts it in another way in his other writings. He says, if nothing in this world can satisfy me, then it probably suggests that I'm not made for this world. And so I think it's almost as if when I look at the propensity of religion and its how it's continued and remained throughout human history, and how in every sector of human experience there seems to be this attempt to build some kind of religious structure, I think that's a response to a deep, intuitive desire in the human heart. It's almost like eternity has been put into our hearts. And so we sit in the middle of a conflicting world experience, and we see prosperity and suffering and joy and sadness, and we see peace and war. And in the midst of all the craziness, we struggle to make sense of it precisely because eternity has actually been put into our hearts, because we come from someone, somewhere. I would say it's because we have a remnant of home inside of us that somewhere deep inside we actually remember, and that's what we long for. And so we have the advent of religion. Now, as I've said before, I think religion can actually be a good thing and is ultimately an inevitable thing in so many ways. Why do I say that? Because if we're going to acknowledge, as we've been trying to make the case for now, that we have this deep inbuilt need for the transcendent, it's inevitable that we would try and access the transcendent in some way, right? It's inevitable that we would try and access God in some way then. And so we go about building religions. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong in and of itself. I think religions can be really, really helpful if you think about religions as a doorway to somewhere else. So if you imagine that you and I are caught up in the temporary, we have this desire for the eternal. Religious practices can act as a kind of portal linking the temporary to the eternal. So things like fasting, prayer, meditation of scripture, gathering together of common believers, things like musical worship, things like meditation, all these kinds of things can act as doorways from the temporary to the eternal. And in that sense, if we use our religious practices as doorways, I think religion can be good. I think the problem comes in, however, when we get stuck in the doorway, when what was supposed to be a means to something else becomes the end in itself, when we become more devoted to our religion than to the God it's trying to lead us to. I think when we get stuck here, this becomes profoundly, profoundly destructive. And you've met people like this, right? This is, I'm going to stereotype here, but it's so classic that I'm sure you'll be able to relate. You go to church and there's the old lady who has memorized basically the entire Bible, right? And she just knows this whole thing back to front, but she's just still like a terrible, like a really bad person, right? And she knows, love your neighbor as you love yourself, back to front. But the irony of the fact that she doesn't love her neighbor as she loves herself has never really dawned on her, because she's more devoted to memorizing the scriptures than becoming like the Jesus that those scriptures is trying to lead her toward. Do you see what I'm saying? It's the lady, shame, let's stop picking on ladies. It's the old dude who's at church, and he's faithfully attending church every Sunday and has done for the past 40 years. And when he gets into church, he bumps the new person who's coming to seek something from God out of the pew because that's his seat. Right? It's like, why did you come to church in the first place? Because the church, that gathering, that space was supposed to lead you somewhere else. And so as much as I make fun of the candles and the Cassocks, possibly really, really helpful as some kind of visual stimulator that would lead us somewhere else. The problem is when we become so obsessed with the candles and the cassocks that it has to be those candles and these cassocks and done in this way. And we must kneel now and do it with this song and according to these bells. And then when the means becomes the end, now religion starts to become really, really destructive. And you see this in scriptures. In the Christian scriptures, there's the story of the Pharisees, right? And basically the Pharisees were Israelites who had been given doorways by God. So that's what the Christian tradition would believe. God gave these Israelites some doorways to his presence. And then over time, they just added more and more laws and rules and regulations, and they became obsessed with the way of the Pharisee. And so what was meant to be a gateway to something else became their obsession. They got stuck in the doorway, so much so that when the God they were supposed to be believing in showed up in their own backyard, they crucified him. And can I suggest that this religious spirit of getting stuck in the doorway, this religious ideology, it doesn't only belong to inverted commas spiritual people. I think it goes across the board. So if I may ask and put the question out there, is like, haven't you met before, I know I have, people who maybe would recognize themselves as atheist or agnostic, and in reality, they are more devoted to defending their atheistic position than they are to discovering truth. And so if reason and thought was for them some kind of doorway toward truth, at some point they got stuck in the doorway, and it's very hard to even have a conversation with these people because they're almost like violently defensive against anything that would call their non-belief in God into question. And so it's almost like they set the pursuit of truth to the side, and now they're devoted followers of the atheist way, right? Can you see how this idea of religion is so expansive? It moves across so much of our human experience. Because why? Because it starts, where do we start with this? It starts with our desire for the transcendent. And so we start entering into these practices. And then these practices start to lead us somewhere. But where they lead us is off a cliff. Into surrender, right? Because if we're talking about the transcendent, we're talking about that which goes beyond us. And so we see that, and very few of us actually want to jump or give up the kind of power that's necessary in order to step through the door into what it's actually leading us to. Which is why so much religion is actually just a projection of ego. It's a power issue, because we want God, but we want God on our terms. And so instead of letting God be God, instead of letting the transcendent be the transcendent, we control the transcendent. And so now it's a sanctified idolatry, right? And that's so incredibly destructive. And so this is the idea of religion. Good religion, bad religion. I think the problem with cassocks and candlesticks is when cassocks and candlesticks become the point. And the invitation of the Follower podcast is that we wouldn't kind of get on that train that's just about demeaning religion or throwing stones at everybody. As I've said, I think there is actually some good in our ability to build doorways between the temporary and the eternal, but that we wouldn't get stuck in religion, that we would let the doorway lead us to where it leads us, which is to a place where we have to actually give up some control and some power and allow that which we've been pursuing to be what or who they are. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next episode, when we talk about the first conversion in the journey of following Jesus from religion to relationship. I hope this has been helpful for you. If this is good for you and if you do enjoy it, you can find the Follower podcast pretty much anywhere there are podcasts on iTunes, Podbean, etc. Please subscribe and become a follower of Follower. Also, the Follower podcast is sponsored by you. So if this is helpful for you, I want to encourage you to think about doing a once-off or monthly donation. That helps me make these so that we can keep having this conversation. And then finally, if you know people in your world who you think need to be brought into this conversation and have some of these seeds of thought begin to stir in their minds, please share it with them. Share it with everybody on every platform so everybody can get involved. I would love that. So that's Candles and Cassocks, guys. Basically, don't get stuck in the doorway. Don't get stuck in the doorway. And it would be good at this point, as you've listened to this and as the podcast comes to an end, to do a little inventory of your own spirituality. Whether you're a believer in some kind of God or not, you carry a kind of spirituality. And is it possible that in your pursuit of the transcendent, a journey you started a while back, that at some point you got afraid of the power you would have to lose to complete that journey, and so you got stuck in the doorway, and now you've made a God out of the religion, and so it's become a Trojan horse, and what was supposed to be gift has been turned into God and is now overthrowing the kingdom. Have a look at your own spirituality. How much have you got stuck in the doorway? And listen in to the next episode as we discuss what it means to move from the doorway off the cliff and into actual friendship with God.